So today's daf is Tzadichet. We are starting the Mishnah Tzadi Zayin Amud Bet at the bottom of the page. This is a Mishnah that appears in Masekhet Shabbat already. It's been discussed, and a lot of the sugya that we're going to see today, we actually saw before in another form, slightly differently in Masekhet Shabbat. So it might ring a bell. But Haya Koreh B'Sefer Al Iskupa. If a person is reading in a sefer, now back then they didn't have printed books like bound books. They had only scrolls. So if a person's reading from a sefer, it means that they're reading from an actual scroll. In other words, they had a rolled up scroll that they would read from. And he's sitting on the porch, v'nitgalgela sefer miyado, and all of a sudden, as can happen sometimes, it rolls. He's holding one end of it, but it rolls forward. And what happens is it's low, so he can roll it back to himself, no problem. But hayakore b'rosh hagag. But what happens if the person is sitting on top of the roof? V'nitgalgela sefer miyado, and there the one end of the scroll falls out of his hand. It rolls out of his hand, but he's holding the other end. Ad shelo yigia la'asarat tefachim, golelo etzlo. Mi shehigia la'asarat tefachim, hofecho la'ketav. So he says, if it didn't reach 10 tefachim of the ground. In other words, he's sitting on the roof, and the end of the scroll falls over the roof and is hanging. It's dangling in midair, let's assume. We're going to see that the Gemara is going to have a different interpretation, but let's say it's dangling in midair, but it's not within 10 tefachim of the ground. So since it's not within 10 tefachim of the ground, now you're sitting in a Reshut HaYachid. You're sitting in a private domain because the roof is a private domain. Now, and your sefer is hanging in the public domain. So the problem is, how can you bring something from the public domain into the private domain? That's the concern. So, right, so that's the thing. If it's above 10 tefachim, we're not worried. If it's within 10 tefachim, now it's no good. So what do you have to do? So he turns it over onto the writing. In other words, the side that has the writing on it, he turns it over so that it's underneath. That way, that the rain or the elements or whatever, since he can't bring it back to himself, this way the elements are not going to ruin the writing. Now let's see. I think that they had some pictures of this.
Why can't you bring it back if it's
344?
So really, technically, yeah. So they have a picture of it. The difference between iskupa is this sort of little step or this little porch, whatever you want to call it. There's the sefer rolling. Now, in the case here, really, technically, it should only be, at worst, d'Rabbanan, because you're holding half of the object. So the object is definitely not fully resting in the Reshut HaRabim. So it shouldn't be an issue anyway.
I'm sorry.
What's the problem?
If it's above 10 tefachim, it's not in Reshut HaRabim.
Right, we're talking about when it is within 10 tefachim, you have to turn it over, right? Those are the two cases.
Sorry.
So if it's not within 10 tefachim of the ground, then you can roll it back. Right, then you just pull it back. But if it is, so that you can't roll it back, so what do? You flip it over. That's like the second solution. Now, even if you were to pull it back to yourself, it would only be an Isur d'Rabbanan because you're holding part of the item, and we learned that the item has to be completely in the Reshut HaRabim to be prohibited to move it into the Reshut HaYachid. However, there's a concern that if you were to do this, you might drop it might fall, and then you're also going to go and bring it from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid. So once it enters the Reshut HaRabim airspace, that 10 tefachim, now you can no longer roll it back.
So you're here, there's 10 tefachim here, the book falls here, you were talking about...
It's hanging within 10 tefachim of the ground.
Oh, it didn't fall.
It's hanging down, but it didn't fall. You're holding one end.
Oh.
You're holding one end, it unraveled, and the other end started dangling.
It's a scroll.
Yeah, it's a scroll.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
That's what I mentioned in the beginning. It's a scroll, not a book, because they didn't have books. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if it's a needle's breadth away from the ground, you can roll it back to yourself. In other words, unless it's actually sitting in that end of the scroll is actually resting in the Reshut HaRabim, you can bring it back. He doesn't care about 10 tefachim.
So this discussion is only relevant because it's a scroll. If it was like a wire or a cord, then there's no question that there's an isur. You would have to just let it go. You wouldn't
let it go either, because now you're transferring it from one place to another. You have to leave that end there and let it dangle, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
You have to let it dangle. So that was that. So Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, afilu ba'aretz atzmo. Even if it's touching the ground, so you have three opinions. Opinion number one is the Chachamim, who say that if this dangling scroll dangles within 10 tefachim of the ground, you can't roll it back. You just have to flip it over on it, so that the writing is downwards, and you have to leave it there. According to Rabbi Yehuda,
brains.
That's
the whole point.
Yeah, that's the whole point. That's why you turn it upside down.
The whole point is that we're discussing about saving.
The scroll of Sefer Torah. It's going to be
Right.
So that's true.
About saving it.
Right.
You do the best you can. You turn it over.
The flood.
Right.
No, you're right. You're right.
So
Yeah,
what they're discussing.
That's what they're trying to discuss: how to balance Shabbat and the Sefer Torah. That's the issue. Right. Shabbat. So the issue is Shabbat. Well, they're trying to figure out what to do. We have a problem of rules of Shabbat, laws of Shabbat on one hand, and Kiddushat Sefer Torah on the other hand. Or it's not a Sefer Torah, but it's a scroll that people would read out of. So it's not really, it doesn't have like Kiddushat on the level of a Sefer Torah necessarily. It doesn't say that. But that's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Rabbi Shimon is saying, even if this thing is actually resting on the ground below, you have to bring it back up. Why? Because the whole thing is only an Isur D'Rabbanan, because you're holding one end of it. So how can you allow an Isur D'Rabbanan to disrespect this scroll that you're going to leave it there like that? Now the whole Shabbat, that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying exactly what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Rabbi Shimon is saying that how can you leave it there for the rest of Shabbat? Even if it's touching the ground, you have to roll it back, because how could you leave it? It's not respectful to the scroll. So that's your point exactly. Now, the Gemara says, Hai iskupa hechidame. Now the first case is not clear. All right, we understand the case where you're sitting on the roof and the scroll is dangling downwards, and we have to determine how much is it dangling, is it resting on the ground, and so on. So you had the three opinions. 10 tefachim, that was the first one. Second opinion was, if it's within a hair, as long as it's still dangling and not resting. Third opinion, even if it's resting, you can roll it back. Those were the three opinions. But the iskupa was the first one, and the iskupa said that if you're sitting there and it rolls, you can roll it back. But what is an iskupa? What is it talking about? So, ilema iskupa reshut yachid. Okay, so v'kama reshut rabim. If you're telling me that this iskupa place where you're reading is a reshut yachid, and what's in front of you? A reshut rabim, and it rolled out into there. And we are not worried that maybe the whole scroll is going to roll and you're going to go and bring it back, because that's the whole concern. In other words, just like when you're sitting on the roof and the scroll unravels and is hanging down, our concern is if we let you roll it back in that case, then next time if it falls off the roof and it's in the reshut rabim, you're also going to bring it into the reshut yachid. That's the concern. So here, maybe it's the same thing. We're talking about where you're sitting in a reshut yachid. The reshut rabim is in front of you. The scroll is unraveled and rolled into the street. And why are you allowed to roll it back? Because we hold like Rabbi Shimon. Mani, it says, Rabbi Shimon. It is Rabbi Shimon, because what do we see in the Mishnah? That Rabbi Shimon says, you can always roll things back if it's a scroll. If a scroll is involved, we bend the rules. Because he says that anytime it's a rabbinic prohibition, like here, where it's a rabbinic prohibition to roll the scroll back, since you're holding the part of it in the Reshut Yachid anyway. So he says that we don't make gezerot, we don't make rabbinic prohibitions when it's going to be at the cost, at the expense of disrespecting Ketvei HaKodesh, and so therefore the iskupa could be a Reshut Yachid. There's only one problem with that though. He says. Now before it said in the Mishnah it says Melo Machat. That was the text that we had in the Mishnah, which was a needle's width, but the Girsah of the Yerushalmi and the Rif, which is here reflected in the Gemara, is kimlochut, that it's the width of a string. I mean, in both cases, we're talking about a tiny amount. Golilo etzlo. Rabbi Shimon omer afilu ba'aretz etzmo golilo etzlo. And so we had subsequently in the Mishnah, it said that in the case where you're sitting on the roof, according to Rabbi Yehuda, as long as it's a tiny amount above the ground, you can roll it back. And according to Rabbi Shimon, even if it's resting on the ground, you can roll it back. Now wait a second. If Rabbi Shimon is the Tana Kama, who said the first case of the iskupa, why does he come back later in the Mishnah and add his opinion to the other list of opinions? In other words, according to this, the first statement in the Mishnah, that if you're sitting on the iskupa and the scroll unravels, that's only according to Rabbi Shimon, not according to anybody else. And then the case of the roof, that is where you see the argument, where Rabbi Shimon chimes in. Why is Rabbi Shimon chiming in there if the whole thing was Rabbi Shimon? From the beginning, the iskupa was Rabbi Shimon. So what does it say? The Gemara says, Resha v'sefa Rabbi Shimon metziata Rabbi Yehuda. So you're going to tell me that the first part of the Mishnah when we opened was Rabbi Shimon. The middle part is Rabbi Yehuda. That's what you're telling me? That's an unusual structure and format for the Mishnah. So Rabbah Amar, Rabbah says, no, you're right, that's a problem. So first the Gemara says, in. Amar Rav Yehuda says, in, yes. Resha v'sefa Rabbi Shimon v'tziata Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to say that yes, that is what it means. That is the format of the Mishnah. It's unusual. But the case of the iskupa is only the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And then the case on the roof, where there's an opinion of the Chachamim and the opinion of the Rabbi Huda and the opinion of Rabbi Shimon again. Okay, so apparently that's the structure according to Rabbi Yehuda. But now the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda Rabba Amar. Rabbi Yehuda I'm sorry, no, I skipped. I called it. Yeah, it should be just Rabba, right? That's it. So Rabbi Yehuda said Amar Rabbi Yehuda. In Reisha v'Sifar Rabbi Shimon, Metziata Rabbi Yehuda. So that's the beginning and the end is Rabbi Shimon, and the middle is Rabbi Yehuda. But now Rabba Amar, Rabba says, Hacha b'iskupa hanidreset askinan. What we're talking about is an iskupa that is heavily traveled, and since it's heavily traveled, mishum bizayon kitvei hakodesh aru rabbanan, and everybody agrees that since this is laying in, it would be like it's laying in the middle of the street. Everyone's going to walk right over it, the Kitvei HaKodesh. And therefore, since it's laying in the middle of the street, everybody agrees you can roll it back in that case. When it's hanging from the roof, people are not going to step on it. So there, the Chachamim will say, okay, leave it there, bring it later, whatever. But here, it's actually rolled out into the street. There, people walk here. Abaye raised an objection. It says in the Tosefta, in the Braita, that if it rolled out 4 amot away from the iskupa, then you can't roll it back. If it's within 4 amot, then you can. So within 4 amot, you can roll it back. Outside of 4 amot, you have to flip it over on its back, like we said. But wait a second. If we're talking about an iskupa that people are trampling on, then why should it make a difference how far it rolled out? You're telling me that once you have an issue that this scroll is laying in an area where people trample all the time, you're telling me once it's like that, everybody agrees you have to roll it back. So why should it make a difference if it rolled out 4 amot or less than 4 amot?
In this discussion, it's still kind of not clear what they exactly mean by iskupa, because
it's a stoop or something in front of the table.
So how can so if we're talking about 10 tefachim, right? How can 10 tefachim be heavily traveled? Like if you have anything more than
in other words, let's say it's an entrance because it's an entrance into something that everybody got. You were
if it's out 4 tefachim on the
away from you, but let's say in other words, let's say it's the synagogue, it's the stoop right here. What if you're sitting on the stoop right there? People walk in and out. They're going to trample right on it. Now, in other words, it's you're sitting on a stoop in front of a public spot.
And there are steps.
Right, there are steps or something. People are going to trample on there. Yeah. So Ella Amar Abaye, rather Abaye says Hacha b'iskupa karmelitas kideh. This is also the conclusion in Masekhet Shabbat as well, that the iskupa here must be a karmelit. Reshut harabim over at the fanea, and in front of it is a reshut harabim. Now, why? Now this is easier to explain than the first interpretation, because the first interpretation said that the case of the iskupa is only Rabbi Shimon agrees with that. And he's the hidden Tana in the beginning. And then he comes up later, which makes it clumsy, this style of the Mishnah. So this is what Abaye says, you know what? The first case is agreed upon by everyone because it's only a Karmelit. It's not from a Reshut Yachid to a Reshut Harabim, but it's a Karmelit. And therefore, what does he say? That if תוך דלת אמותין אפילו מאיתי לא עתי לידי חיוב חטאת, שרו לרבנן. חוץ 4 אמות אם הייתי עתי לידי חיוב חטאת, לא שרו לרבנן. So he says like this, very simply. What is the reason why we make a gezerah that you can't carry from a Reshut Harabim to a Karmelit?
Because of what it looks like.
So, in other words, in a case where where it rolled out, in other words, so we're not concerned basically about the transfer from the outside to the Carmelit. It's only rabbinic. Right. But what we are concerned about is when you go to retrieve the scroll, you're going to move it 4 amot in the Reshut Harabim. Forget about the Carmelit. In other words, so what he says is that if, now everyone agrees again, that if something is, one end of it is here, and one end of it is here, it's not considered transferring to roll it up to here. It's not. Because it wasn't fully resting in place A. It was half in place A and half in place B. Okay? So everyone agrees. But what's the concern? The concern is that if it rolls out more than 4 amot, if it were to fall and the whole thing were to roll out 4 amot and you were to go get it, what would happen? You'd be carrying 4 amot in the Reshut Harabim. Not that you bring it into the Carmelit. We don't care about that. That's only rabbinic. So what he's saying is, therefore, if it rolled out more than 4 amot, such that if you were to go get it, if it were to fall that far and you were to go get it, you would be carrying 4 amot in the Reshut HaRabim. Then now that it unraveled that far, even though one end of it is in your hand and you're sitting on the iskupa, you can't roll it back up. But if it's within 4 amot of where you're sitting, such that even if it had fallen there and you had brought it back, it would only be less than 4 amot carrying in the Reshut HaRabim, then we allow you to roll it back.
Is it assumed that if the edge of the scroll has traveled more than 4 amot, it's as if the entire thing has traveled 4 amot?
Only rabbinically, but not deoraita. Deoraita, if only one end has traveled, it's still considered to be in your hand.
In other words, okay, so
right.
In other words,
it's still in your hand.
One more, okay.
So rolling is always okay, Teresa.
Right.
But
if one end is in one place and one in the other place,
the issue is
rolling, meaning that one end of it is in one place.
The reason that we do it is to protect against if it really fell.
Right, because so you wouldn't misunderstand. Now, in the rolling is only rabbinic when one end is in your hand. I mean, if you have like something that you roll like a wheelbarrow or something, that would be okay. So now the question becomes, if that's true. Why don't we say further than that? Why don't we say, listen, even if it only unraveled 3 amot, we should make a gezerah that if it were to have fallen 3 amot, if it were to have been fallen 3 amot, and instead of the iskupa being a karmelit, it were a reshut hayachid, now you'd be carrying from the reshut harabim to reshut hayachid. So why aren't we worried about that? Why aren't we worried about that confusion? That maybe you're going to carry it from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid. In other words, and so Rashi explains here, he says that if the person, so the Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he says, "Nigzar, we should make a gzera. Dilma nafal kulei miyado, va'azil v'shakilei b'reshut harabim, u'maytei leberaglav betoch habayit derech ha'iskupa." In other words, even if the iskupa itself is a karmelit, the concern is if it drops even 1 inch into the reshut harabim, and then he picks it up and he walks inside the house, now he transferred from the reshut harabim to the reshut hayachid. V'chi tema kevan de Masekhet karmelit leitlan ban. Maybe you'll tell me, well, since he has to go over the iskupa anyway, he's going from reshut harabim to iskupa, which is a karmelit, into the Reshut HaYachid. Ve'amar Rava said, "Hama'avir chayfetz mitchilat arba l'sof arba v'heviro derech alav chayav." That Rava said that if a person carries something from Dalid Amot, 4 Amot in the Reshut HaRabim, from the beginning to the end of 4 Amot, and he carried it derech alav, he carried it high up, so that it didn't travel in the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim. It traveled on his head, let's say. He was carrying on his head. It was above the space of the Reshut HaRabim. So its actual transfer was above the space of the Reshut HaRabim. It began in the Reshut HaRabim. It ended 4 amot later in the Reshut HaRabim, but it traveled above the Reshut HaRabim. There, Rava said what? That it would be considered still transferring 4 amot in the Reshut HaRabim. So too here. If you pick something up in the Reshut HaRabim, and you transfer it over the stoop, which is a karmelit, and it lands now in the Reshut HaYachid, we don't care that the transfer took place through a karmelit. So therefore, we should be concerned that a person will pick something up in this. In other words, that if the scroll had fallen into the Reshut HaRabim even 1 inch, and the person were to have picked it up and brought it in the house, that it would be a deoraita. So why don't we make a gzera that if it rolls even a little bit into the Reshut HaRabim, we're concerned that maybe you'll confuse that with the case where it falls, and maybe you'll bring it into the house. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about here? Iskupa aruka. We're talking about a long iskupa. That he'll realize and he'll stop before he actually brings it into the house. Okay? So then the Gemara says, alternatively, it's a regular iskupa. But the truth is that when you pick up a scroll, what does a person do? They start looking at it. And therefore you're going to look at it, you're going to stop in the karmelit, and you're not going to carry directly from the Reshut HaRabim into the Reshut HaYachid. You're going to stop midway. Now this is a realist asking this question. Maybe it's going to fall. He's going to pick it up in the Reshut HaRabim, look at it a little bit, and then he's going to carry it right into the house. So then he never stopped in the Karmelit. He transferred it basically directly from Reshut HaRabim to Reshut HaYachid. Although he walked through the Karmelit, we don't care about that.
So he stopped in the Karmelit. Didn't we learn a few back that you're not allowed to do that?
You're not allowed to, but the thing is we wouldn't make a gezerah lest you do it.
Okay.
Right? If we're sure that you're going to do that, we only make a gezerah that's direct. We're not going to make a gezerah on every possible every case that's a step removed from the actual violation. So who must this be following? Ben Azaihi. It's Ben Azai's opinion. The Amar Malech Omed Dame. As we learned in Masekhet Shabbat, Ben Azai says walking is like standing. In other words, even if you're walking, you're standing. So if you were to walk from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid, derech a Karmelit, through the Karmelit, what happens? We look at your walking in the Karmelit as standing. So it's as if you stopped in the middle. In other words, he holds that the entire transfer has to be from Reshut HaRabim to Reshut HaYachid directly. Walking through a Karmelit midway would break the transfer, and therefore we're holding like him. That's why we're not concerned here, because since you have to go through the Iskupa, which is a Karmelit, you're going from point A to point B, but there's something in the middle, and therefore we don't make a gezerah lest you carry it into the house, because we know that even in the worst case scenario that you picked up the scroll outside in the Reshut HaRabim and you walked over the Iskupa into the house, you've walked through a Karmelit, and according to Ben Azai, that means it's not a direct transfer from public to private domain. Vidil mazarik lehu mizrag. Maybe you're going to throw it from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid. Okay, walking is one thing. Walking from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid with a Karmelit in the middle, Ben Azai says the Karmelit interrupts the walking. But what about you threw it inside? So of course the answer is going to be Amar Rav Chabar Ahava Zot Omeret En Mizarakin Ketvei HaKodesh. This shows you we don't throw those. We don't throw Ketvei HaKodesh. It's not appropriate to throw them. So therefore, since we don't throw them, therefore we're not worried that you're going to throw it from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid, and that means that we're not concerned. The only thing we're concerned about is walking. And since in walking, according to Ben Azai, the walking from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid, since you have to pass through a Karmelit, it interrupts the process of transfer. It's not a direct transfer, and therefore we're not worried that you're going to drop this. If you drop the scroll in the Reshut HaRabim from the Iskupa, that there's no way that it could be transferred from that Reshut HaRabim into the Reshut HaYachid. That would be what we'd be worried about. The only concern we have is if it were to fall more than 4 amot, that you might carry it 4 amot in the Reshut HaRabim to get to the Iskupa. That was the only concern. Now we go to the next piece, Hayakore B'Rosh Hagag. We go to the next case is that you're sitting on the roof. Umishare. It says you turn over the kitab, and this was what one of the issues that Sammy was alluding to before. Turning over the kitab is not very respectful to turn it over onto the writing and to leave the underside facing upward. So is that really permitted? Vatani, we learned in a Braita, Kotvei Sfarim, Tefillin Mezuzot. People who are sofrim, they write Sifrei Torah, they write Tefillin, they write Mezuzot. Lo yitziru len lahapech yiri al panea. You're not allowed to turn it over. Let's say you want to guard the writing that you've been doing so it doesn't get smudged, doesn't get ruined. You're not allowed to turn it upside down. Or you don't want dust to settle on it and ruin the ink, or whatever it is. You don't want whatever problem. You don't want it to be exposed. But you can cover it with some kind of a cloth. So why are we saying here to flip it over? So the answer is Hatam Efshar Hachalo Efshar. He says that the sofer has the option of covering it with a cloth. You don't have the option of doing that. You're not allowed to bring a cloth and cover the scroll that's dangling from the roof. You'd have to dangle the cloth from the roof to do that. Right, so you're not allowed to do that. And so we have a choice. Either leave it that way or turn it upside down. And it's minimizing the bizayon. It's minimizing the disrespect to the Sefer Torah to turn, or whatever Sefer you're reading, to turn it upside down. But in the case of the Sofer, that he has the option to get like a nice cloth to cover it gently and to protect the writing, that's what he is obligated to do. It says you turn it upside down, but it has not rested. In other words, the issue here is, since it has not come to rest, in other words, in the first case, when it rolled from the Iskupa into the street, so there it's resting on the ground of the Reshut HaRabim. But dangling from the roof, it's not even resting in the Reshut HaRabim. What's the problem with rolling it back up? Rashi says, Afilu Shavut Leka. It's not even a dirabanan. It's not even resting. It's just dangling. So he says, in other words, it's a dirabanan even if you're holding it, even if it were resting on the ground, it's a dirabanan. But here we're talking about dangling. So the answer is that Amar Rava says, Bekotel Mishupa. We're talking about a roof that's on an angle. In other words, the roof is diagonal, okay? It's not a flat roof. So we were envisioning that you're sitting on the edge of the flat roof and the scroll is hanging down. So it's dangling in midair. But now Rava says, no, we're talking about a kotel mishupa. We're talking about a wall that is on an angle. So actually, when you lost control of the scroll, one end of it is rolling down, but it's resting. It's like on a ramp. Okay, it's not dangling in midair. It's rolling down on a ramp, and it rests within 10 tefachim of the ground, but it's not dangling in midair. It's actually resting on this wall that is an angle that comes out from the house. You can imagine a triangular structure.
Regular sloping roof.
A sloping roof, but it's a sloping house, even. A sloping wall.
So
it goes all the way down to within 10 tefachim of the ground. Okay? Yeah, so Amar Le Abaye says, yeah, sure. For sure it could be. Amar Le Abaye says, B'mai okimta lematnitin b'kotel mishupa. You're telling me that we're dealing here with a slanted wall. So what about the end? Rabbi Yehuda Omer afilu eno misulak min haaretz ela miloachut golo etzlo v'anachle. So then Rabbi Yehuda says that even if it's only a string's width from the ground, you can roll it back. But wait a second, it's resting in the Reshut HaRabim according to this. Because you're telling me that it's on the wall, and it's within a tiny amount from the Reshut HaRabim. It's resting in the Reshut HaRabim. How could he say that you could roll it back? So the Gemara says, it's missing something. This is what it should say. When is it that the only issue is whether it's within 10 tefachim of the ground or not? Where we said if it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, you can roll it back. And I'm sorry, you can't roll it back. And if it's not within 10 tefachim of the ground, you can. That's when you're dealing with a slanted wall. But in a case where the wall is not slanted, in other words, that it's dangling in midair, like we originally thought, so there the Chachamim say lemala mishlosha golelo etzlo lemata mishlosha hofchola ketav. That, and Rabbi Yehuda says, and that's where Rabbi Yehuda comes in. In other words, there's actually another hidden case here. There are two cases of roof. There's a case of roof where the scroll is actually resting on the wall because the wall is diagonal and protrudes out and goes on. It's like a ramp.
Why does that affect the dangling? I mean, the thing can dangle whether it's straight or whether it can dangle.
It's not dangling. In other words, they're saying that there's three cases.
Oh, in other words, it goes all the way.
It goes all the way. The wall goes all the way. It's not the roof. It's actually the wall.
And so it's
actually the wall. It's resting on the side of the wall that protrudes outward.
Okay.
So that was the first case where the Chachamim say if it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, you can't roll it back because that's actually like it's resting and it's in the Reshut HaRabim. If it's more than 10 tefachim above the ground, then it's resting, but it's not in the Reshut HaRabim. If, on the other hand, it's dangling, so that you're sitting on a flat roof, and it's not resting, but it's dangling, so there the Chachamim say, if it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, you can't roll it back. Why? Because within 3 we say lavud. That's within 3 tefachim of the ground. Right? It's considered to be resting in the ground. And that's where Rabbi Yehuda came along and said, no, even if it's a string's width from the ground. And that's where Rabbi Shimon said, even if it's resting on the ground, since one end of it is in your hand, you can roll it back up. Okay? So there's a hidden case and a hidden...
Touching the ground, regardless of whether...
Right, according to Rabbi Shimon.
Then it's considered resting.
Right. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer afilo eno mesulak min haaretz. So debainan hanachal gabe masho. Because Rabbi Yehuda says, why does it have to be? Why even if there is a string's width of space between the edge of the scroll and the ground? Why is that okay according to Rabbi Yehuda? Because he says it has to be resting on something. Okay? It has to be resting on something. And here it's dangling. It's not resting. It's within 3 tefachim of the ground. So in other words, in a halachic world, it's in the Reshut HaRabim because it's within 3 tefachim of the ground. But the only problem is, in reality, it's not resting. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. It has to actually rest.
Is that with anything? Because
the question is,
even if it's
resting is zero.
In reality, it's
no. In other words, it has to be touching. Okay.
No. But we're comparing the 3 tefachim of straight dangling versus hair breadth of.
Right. So it's still dangling.
Okay, but saying that in a realist, from a real world perspective, that it's not touching versus halachic world,
right.
You could say the same thing of the straight as well.
Because they're qualitatively...
No, but it is touching in Rabbi Yehuda's case. He's saying the only case where you can't roll it back is where it's touching. Because when it's actually touching the ground, that's considered munach. It's actually resting. The weight of the scroll is on the ground.
The argument.
Okay, we're talking now about the flat roof. The scroll is dangling down.
Right.
Now, according to the Chachamim, if the end of it is within 3 tefachim of the ground,
right,
that's considered to be resting in the Reshut HaRabim. You can't roll it back up.
Okay.
According to Rabbi Yehuda, even if it's a slight bit over the ground,
right,
it's still considered dangling, and you can roll it back because it's not resting. If it's touching the ground, now Rabbi Yehuda says you can't roll it back.
Right. So now the question is why? So they're
because that's considered nach. It's considered resting.
Right. So they're raising the question now.
They didn't raise a question. They just commented so far.
Okay.
There's commented so far. Now they're going to raise a question. So now, Rava said, that what about that which Rava said? Rava said that within 3 tefachim of the ground, even according to the Rabbanan, requires hanacha. In other words, there are 2 issues according to Rava. Rava says there are 2 issues. One is it has to be in the Reshut HaRabim, and number 2, it has to be resting. Resting is separate. Even if it's within 3 tefachim, it still has to be resting. So it has to be actually on something.
But not necessarily the ground.
It doesn't have to necessarily be the ground. It could be resting on a dandelion. Okay, it doesn't matter. Anything. Okay, but it has to be something. If it's within 3 tefachim. So, lema katanae, but according to that, Rava's position is subject to a dispute here. Because true that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that within 3 tefachim is not good enough. It's not good enough that it's within 3 tefachim. It has to be resting. But the Chachamim seem to say that if it's within 3 tefachim, that's it. It doesn't have to be resting. So are you telling me lemat ketanae amara lishmate? You're telling me that Rava was taking a position here. He was only going with one view. He wasn't going with the view of the Chachamim. He was only going with the view of Rabbi Yehuda. So Ella Kula Rabbi Yehudahi v'chasure mechasra v'achikatane. Really, the entire Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. It's missing something, and this is what it means to say Bamed Varim Amurim Bakotel Mishupa. That when are we saying that we have these distinctions? When you have the Kotel Mishupa, when you have the angled, the roof that's on an angle, right, or the wall that is slanted. Aval Bakotel Sheino Mishupa Afilu Pachot Mishloshat Tefachim Goldo Etzlo She Rabbi Yehuda Omer Afilu Eno Misulag Min Haaretz Ela Melo Achut Golelo Etzlo Ma'ita. Basically, they rewrite the hidden section of the Mishnah to say as follows: that the machloket in the Mishnah, or the issue of the Chachamim that we saw in the Mishnah, that they said if it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, you can't roll it back. If it's higher than 10 tefachim from the ground, you can roll it back. That was talking about when it's on the slanted wall. Now, what if it's just dangling straight down? So there, even if it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, you can roll it back. She Rabbi Yehuda Omer, because Rabbi Yehuda says that it must be resting, even if it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, it must be resting on something to be qualified as being in the Reshut HaRabim. And everybody agrees with that, apparently. She Rabbi Yehuda Omer, because Rabbi Yehuda said that. And then Rabbi Shimon comes along and says, true, but since it's only D'Rabbanan, since you're holding the other end of the scroll, you can still roll it back. Because we don't want to disrespect the scroll. But there's no machloket. It's not that the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Everybody agrees, according to Rava, everybody agrees that an object must be resting on something in the Reshut HaRabim to be considered at rest, even if it's within 3 tefachim of the ground. Now the new Mishnah says, Ziz shelefnei chalon notnim alav ve'notlin mimeno b'Shabbat. If you have a little piece, a protrusion in front of the window, you can place things on it and take from it on Shabbat. And we have a picture of this ziz, what this is referring to, in the back of the, or you guys have it in a separate book. I have it in the back of my Gemara, a picture of what this is supposed to look like. It's illustration number 345. So you can see, this is an illustration of a later case, but this is the kind of thing it's talking about, a protrusion from the wall. We're going to see more of this later. This case we'll see in a second, but let's first see what the issue is. So you have this protruding piece coming out, and Rashi says it's 10 tefachim above the ground, and it is 4 tefachim wide. So that means it's Reshut HaYachid. So the people who are inside the house can put things on their windowsill, basically. Imagine it's like a windowsill. They can put things on the windowsill and take things off of it because they're in the Reshut HaYachid, and it's a Reshut HaYachid, no problem, right? The windowsill. No problem. Okay. So now, the Gemara says, Hi, Ziz de Mapik Lehecha. Where is this Ziz facing to? If right in front of our window is a Reshut HaRabim, and this Ziz, this windowsill or whatever it is facing the Reshut HaRabim as well, maybe if you put something on the windowsill, it's going to fall. You put your flower pot there. It's going to fall. And now what happens when it falls? And you're going to bring it back inside. Right? That's a problem. Rather, if it's facing a Reshut HaYachid, then Pshita, obviously you can put something on the windowsill. What do you care if it falls from your Reshut HaYachid to another Reshut HaYachid? You'll just bring it back. Amar Abaye says, he says, what really, this window opens to a Reshut HaRabim, and the windowsill is facing the Reshut HaRabim. What are you allowed to put on the windowsill? Things that break if they fall. Like a flower pot, for example. You can put something on there that's breakable. Why? Because even if it were to fall, you're not going to go get it. It's broken, that's it. But you can't put a precious thing on there, because if you put a precious thing of value on there, and it falls into the Reshut HaRabim, you're going to go and you're going to run and get it. You're not going to leave it there. So therefore, he says you can only put things that are breakables that you will part with if they fall. Tani nami achi. We learned similarly in a braita. Ziz shelefnei hachalon. If you have a protrusion in front of the window, hayotze l'Reshut HaRabim, which faces the Reshut HaRabim, notnim alav ke'arot ve'kosot, kitoniyot ve'tzlochiyot. You can put up on it plates, and you can put on it cups and kitoniyot and tzlochiyot are drinking implements, various kinds of cups and glasses, and why can you put those specific items? Because they're breakables. If they fall, that's it. The glass fell, it broke, that's it. So you're not going to go pick it up out of the Reshut HaRabim. Umishtamesh b'chol hakotel ad asara hatachtonim. And you can use the entire wall up to the 10 lower tfachim, because the 10 lower tfachim are actually part of the Reshut HaRabim. So if you're in the Reshut HaYachid, you can't use the lower 10 tfachim of the wall, because lower 10 tfachim of the wall are part of the Reshut HaRabim. Ve'im yesh ziz echad lemata mimenu. And if there is another protrusion underneath the protrusion that comes out from your window, but it's still over 10 tfachim. In other words, your apartment is, let's say, 100 tfachim high. You have a ziz coming out, and then underneath it is one that's 90 tfachim over the ground. So you can use both of them. Okay, mishtamesh bo uba'elyon en mishtamesh bo ela keneged chalono. He says the one that's underneath. In other words, your window, and that's what it's showing here. Your window has this windowsill type thing sticking out, and then underneath it is another plank sticking out. So he says you can use only the part that's direct. The one that comes out from your window, you can use only the part that's directly in front of your window. So you see how it says asur on the side. So these parts that are not directly in front of the window, you're not allowed to use. Only the part that's directly in front of the opening of the window.
Because it might fall.
Well, we'll see why. It didn't say yet. And the plank underneath that's not coming directly out of your window, that you can use the entire thing. Okay, so we'll see why that is. So now the Gemara is going to explain what's the difference here. What are you talking about? Hi, Ziz Hechidame, what are you talking about here? If you're talking about a Ziz, a sort of plank that is less than 4 tefachim in width, so it's a makom petur. It's a nothing. It's insignificant. It's less than it's not considered a Reshut HaYachid. And even in front of his window, we shouldn't be using it. Why not? Because what's going to happen is that because it's so small, things are going to fall out of it, and so it's not a trustworthy place to support. So Rashi says, in other words, even though it's a makom petur, so technically a person in the Reshut HaYachid can put something on the makom petur, and a person in the Reshut HaRabim can put something on a makom petur, right? Even if they're in between the Reshut HaYachid and the Reshut HaRabim, it's okay. We learned that many times. So, but the problem is that since it's not a good support because it's so narrow, people are very likely they're going to be in the Reshut HaRabim and put something on there, and it's going to end up in the Reshut HaYachid, or vice versa, because it's such a small area. So we can't be talking about a case where it's less than 4 tefachim wide, because then you wouldn't be allowed to use it at all, because it's too likely that things will fall out. And if it has 4 tefachim in width, why can't you use the entire plank? Why only the part that's directly in front of the window? So the answer is that Amar Abaye Tachton de'it be'arba'a ve'elyon let be'arba'a v'chalon mashlim matula arba'a keneged chalon mishtamesh dechorei chalonu da'ai gisa u'da'ai gisa asur. So I'll explain what Abaye means to say. What he's saying is that there are 2 planks here, 2 protrusions. One protrusion is 4 tefachim. That's the lower one. The lower one is on its own 4 complete tefachim, and it goes, let's say, along the entire wall. And it's above 10 tefachim. So the people in this upper window can actually use this lower plank as much as they want, because they're in a Reshut HaYachid and it's a Reshut HaYachid right in front of them. However, this plank is less than 4 tefachim. but the inside part of the window makes it 4 tefachim. So the part that's right in front of the window, there's 4 tefachim of space because the actual windowsill and this protrusion combine to make 4 tefachim. Let's say the board itself is only 3 tefachim, but the windowsill is a tefach. So if the window's open, basically, you have an extra tefach and it has a complete 4 tefachim. But on the sides, the board is only 3 tefachim wide. So it's not going to be sufficiently wide. That's why they said that the one that's in front of the window, since without the window's sort of airspace, it's not enough. Without the window sill itself, the protrusion is only 3 tefachim. So you need only the part directly in front of the window is actually 4 tefachim in width. That's the only part you can use. The parts on the side are 3 tefachim in width. Do you understand the case? Okay. Whereas the plank below is an entire 4 tefachim on its own.
But why doesn't the plank below, that also has a status of a private space, why doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't that save anything that it might fall? In other words, it's too...
I guess we can't, it's not going to land on there.
Well,
so the concern is that it's not going to land on there. So what we're really concerned is we're saying that smaller protrusion is only trustworthy to rest anything on when it has the 4 tefach space. But you're not going to put something on that 3 tefach space. It's going to fall and end up in the Reshut HaRabim and then end up being carried in the Reshut HaRabim or whatever. Or fall from the Reshut HaRabim into the Reshut HaYachid if it's a Makom Patur. But the point is that it would be problematic to use it because of the concern that it's not a stable place to put things, and you're very likely for things to fall and to end up having carrying going on from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid.
And that's the issue.
And that's the issue in that case. Stability, right? So the lower one would be good, but the upper one, the chidush there is that you can have a board that in certain spaces is 4 tefachim wide, and that's okay. That place can be considered an extension of the Reshut HaYachid, but in other places is less than 4 tefachim, and in those cases you're not allowed to use those parts, even of the very same plank. There are parts you can use and parts that you can't.